All right, let's start with our top story, which is Ukraine and warnings about a possible nuclear fallout starting to make their rounds. I know it's like we don't want to be alarmist in the same way that Dr. John Campbell said, I want to be alarmist. But when you have Vladimir Putin over the past 24 hours demanding that inspectors, UN Security Council and inspectors come into Ukraine and check the nuclear power plant in this particular area in Zaporizhzhia that has been attacked, shelled by Ukrainians over the past few days, there is cause for concern. So here's the map. Let's just give you a sense of where this is. This is Zaporizhzhia. This is the largest nuclear power plant. It has 6 nuclear reactors in Europe. Of course, the big concern is that what would happen if this actually, with the materials, continues to blow across Western Europe, as you can see here on the map. Like that's where it would blow. It would blow across to Western Europe.
Yes.
Putin and Russia calling for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council over repeated shelling of this nuclear power plant, and they took it back. Of course, they took it over at the early part of March last year. The nuclear reactor sits just west of the town of Zaporizhzhia, and it's been held by Russian forces since then. Moscow wants the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN nuclear watchdog, to come in and take a look at this. But at this hour, Ukraine is saying, no, we don't want that to happen. We don't want you to come in, and we don't want you to look at this.
No, but they're perfectly happy to allow the Western media to say that this story is true and the opposite, right? So despite any fact checking, the Western media has run with this story the way that the Ukrainian government is telling it, but not offering anyone any opportunity to fact check or investigate or inspect.
Yeah, I mean, Kim, are you surprised by the Western media response to this? Of course, is that the Russians attacked a nuclear power plant that they themselves have been holding since March. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah. Like suddenly, since they've had it since I believe March 3rd, suddenly now there's this imminent attack that is going to happen and they're going to go nuclear, right? I mean, that's like literally what they're trying to say is that Russia's going to go scorched earth with this nuclear power plant. And it doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, why would they do that? At this point, the Russians have been making slow but increasing gains throughout Ukraine, taking over territory after, areas of territory. And so it doesn't even make logical sense why they would suddenly need to go scorched earth. So, I do think that ultimately what this is looking like is it looks like Ukraine's attempt, and they've been doing this throughout the entire war, which is try to sound the alarm in order to get more help. So what they've seen is that the United States is not rushing in with troops. As much as they've wanted the West to come in with actual troops, we've of course supplied them with a lot of weapons. And I sympathize with their plight. I sympathize if you are being invaded, you would try to do anything you possibly can. I don't blame the Ukrainians at all, actually, for even exaggerating greatly their situation to try to get anybody and everybody in. But everybody else needs to stop and say, are they exaggerating? I mean, we know they have the motivation to exaggerate. So it would be up to us to stop and say, is this a true, real threat? And it just doesn't look like it when we're looking at a nuclear power plant that's been under Russian occupation since March 3rd. And then suddenly now we're in August and, they're supposedly going to cause a real big problem. So,
and then the narrative that Russia is saying, well, this is not true. So how about we welcome in some inspectors so that the world gets this? The West just doesn't want to hear it. It's blinders on about this.
Well, we just want Russia to be bad in every way, right?
Yes.
It's got to be that whatever Russia's doing, it's just bad, bad, bad. And they're committing genocide. It's sinister. There's no... they're not, of course, if they're going to take a nuclear power plant, that means that they're going to try to blow stuff up. So, that's kind of the mentality, of course, of Western media. And we just have seen that not be the case a lot of the time with what the narrative has been has been off. So.
And so the Ukrainian media, if you want to take a look at some of the fake news that's been floating around, this is some of the fake news coming out of Ukraine on this. And what they'll say is, as a result of the actions of the Russian armed forces, the IAEA cannot verify radiation safety at the nuclear power plant. So they're saying that because Russia has control of it, that the IAEA can't go back in. And what they're also saying then is, what Ukrainian sources are saying is, hey, we want full control of the nuclear power plant before we allow inspectors to go back in. I sat down just a few minutes ago with former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter to talk about this, and here's what he had to say. Scott, were you surprised by the response, the media response to this attack on this nuclear facility in Ukraine?
Well, it's curious. Which attack are we talking about? I mean, I know the media claims that it's a Russian attack on a Ukrainian nuclear facility occupied by Russia, by the way, since March 3rd. So Russia's attacking itself. Or is it the Russian narrative, which has the Ukrainian military attacking a Ukrainian nuclear facility that's currently occupied by Russia? Because that changes changes the entire picture.
Yeah, so I think let's go with the truth. I'm going to err on the side of truth, which is, yes, the Russians have occupied this since early March. The New York Times would have you believe that then Russia was attacking itself with its own troops. It was attacking the nuclear facility while its own troops were there, which is laughable. So let's go with the truth, which is that Ukraine attacked this nuclear facility. What do you know of this attack? And then we'll get into the fallout surrounding this attack.
Well, I know that the attack took place on August 5th. I know that the attack was predicted by none other than Antony Blinken, the United States Secretary of State, who addressed had a press conference on August 1st, where he said, those Russians need to be really careful about carrying out mortar and artillery and rocket attacks from the territory of this nuclear plant, because there could be an accident. I think one of the initial spins was that, there was an accident, that Russia, accidentally attacked itself. They accused Russia of creating a nuclear fortress. You see, because the nuclear plant, the Ukrainians would never attack the nuclear plant, never, because it makes no sense. It's suicide. And so Russia was using this nuclear facility as a base upon which to attack the Ukrainians. This is absurd. The thing about the United States, and I say this as a veteran intelligence officer, is we're pretty good at collecting data. We're not very good at assessing data, but we're very good at collecting data. And one of the things I know we have just stacks of are photographs of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the Russian troop disposition there. So if Russia was actually using the territory of this nuclear power plant to host artillery, rockets, mortars, we'd have photographs on every evening news broadcast saying, hey, this is it, arrows conveniently pointing to the artillery pieces. There's no imagery because it doesn't exist. There's a battalion of 500 Russian soldiers securing the plant. I mean, after all, there is fissile material there, and you don't want to just leave it open to the public. But the plant is run by Ukrainian engineers, overseen, by the way, by the people who actually designed the plant, Russian nuclear scientists, experts in nuclear energy. There's no issues here other than Ukraine is desperate and the United States is desperate to shift the narrative away from an inevitable Russian victory. What we're seeing here is a false narrative of Russia hazarding the world by attempting to recreate a Chernobyl-like disaster that requires the international community to intervene, occupy this territory, pretty much having the international community do what the Ukrainian military can't do, push the Russian military back to take over part of Ukraine's territory and turn it over to the Ukrainians, turn over a nuclear power plant that historically, when all 6 reactors are running, provided up to a quarter of Ukraine's energy needs. Ukraine is concerned, rightfully so, that Russia may seek to shift this nuclear power plant to supply the Russian power grid. That's sort of what victorious powers get to do. But the bottom line is there was no Russian attack on this plant. It was a Ukrainian attack predicted by Antony Blinken and then immediately picked up by the media and parroted mindlessly and blindly. Anybody with a brain would know simply I could do this by looking at the rocket. You look at the rocket, they took photographs of it, and you orient the rocket to photographs, images, maps, and a convenient reverse azimuth points straight back to Ukraine, straight back to Ukraine. So there is no secret here. We know what happened, and everybody who's involved knows this. There's not a single actor in this game who doesn't know exactly what happened. It's just that we are involved in information warfare, an elaborate diplomatic, bullying taking place at the United Nations right now through the International Atomic Energy Agency to try to do Ukraine's bidding. Fortunately, Russia is strong enough and in a good enough position on the ground not to really give a rat's what about what's going on.
I'll ask you this to get you out of here, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, of course. And this, Russia, according to reports, saying, yeah, come on in, examine this, take a look at this, see what actually happened here. The reports are the Ukrainians are saying, no, we don't want you to come in here. And we don't want you to come in here until it's back up in full capacity and we have it back under our control again. What do you make of that?
Well, the Ukrainians have long denied access to the IAEA to the site, because the thing about if you have International Atomic Energy inspectors on site, facts suddenly have to be taken into account. And the IAEA would do a damage assessment, make an immediate report that the attack came from Ukraine. The other thing that they would talk about is the safe operation of the facility, how the Russians actually have everything under control. The facility is fully operating. The only risk to the facility is the danger posed by continued Ukrainian attacks on the facility. That's the last thing the Ukrainians want. So they've come up with this artifice that says that the IAEA can only be credible if Ukraine controls the facility. That's just absurd.
Scott, thank you, as always. Much appreciated for stopping by again on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector. Kim, I'd love to get your thoughts on that. So the idea that they know, they get in there, they could immediately tell where these things came from. I mean, is that why they're keeping these inspectors out of there?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, and another reason is they just, this has kind of been what Ukraine has said from the beginning, or at least well into this war, is that they've demanded that they gain control over all of these areas that the Russians currently have control of, and even areas that the Russians have had control of since 2014, like Crimea and areas of the Donbass. They've been saying, we're not going to negotiate, we're not going to talk, we're not going to do any of that until we want everything back, everything. And that, obviously that's not working. That strategy isn't working. I mean, I just really wish that the Ukrainian government could just stop and self-reflect for a moment and say, maybe it is time. I mean, the Americans are not rushing in. The West, they're not rushing in with troops. They're instead allowing Finland and Sweden into NATO, I mean, which is like a big finger to Ukraine in a lot of ways, right? To say, well, we wouldn't let you into NATO, but we're going to let all these other people in. And so, I mean, at some point, I feel like the Ukrainian government should stop and self-reflect and say, they're not coming to help us. And we've been with Russia in some capacity or another, and they're our neighbor for a long time. So maybe it is time to just start negotiating a peace agreement rather than constantly demanding for everything to come back into Ukrainian control. It's just not going to happen.
Right. So people stop dying today, like right now.
Right.
This is something we've been talking about a lot. Now, on the heels of this Amnesty International report that showed that Ukrainian army has been willing to put civilians in harm's way, this sort of gives pause and makes us ask ourselves, well, would Ukraine be willing then to do something that damages this nuclear site that would harm everybody, right? Is that a possibility? So just today, Dr. John Campbell on his YouTube channel, he was talking about how the possibility of a nuclear cloud or some kind of nuclear episode is not zero now. So we need to all sort of medically think, okay, what would we do in this event? Let's listen to what he has to say.
I don't want to be alarmist, but there is a significant nuclear risk from a power station getting blown up in Ukraine. And this will blow a radioactive cloud or many radioactive clouds, potentially all across Western and potentially Eastern Europe, but most likely Western Europe. The reactor-grade uranium has a half-life of 700 million years, and no, that's not a misprint. It is radioactive for unimaginably long periods of time.
So that's not awesome, right?
Yeah, 700 million years.
Wow.
And he's not an alarmist. I mean, I think we're all fans of him.
Right.
And
Well, he goes on to talk about how if this kind of thing happens, right, then we need to avoid ingesting radioactive material that may come out of this region, right? So we're all sort of celebrating that now Ukrainian grain can be exported. But if there is some kind of event there, we're going to want to steer clear of that Ukrainian grain, right? So this is something, like he says, it's not a zero chance. It's not a 0% chance anymore.
I think there's actually even a fairly, I mean, I don't want to say high chance, but almost, it's well above 0%. I just think as the Ukrainians get more desperate, as the government of Ukraine gets more and more desperate, I worry about what level they will go to, and not only just the Ukrainian government, but just the West in general, to demonize Russia. As we're seeing the rise of Russia, and especially Russia partnering with China, and we're starting to see this sort of new alliance happening, I just don't, unfortunately, I don't put it past our leaders to kind of make a calculation and say, well, it won't hurt us. We're all the way over here. So
Right.
maybe it wouldn't be,
But a
I hate to
major
think that way, but
catastrophe would rally support. So, yes.
yeah.
and it would demonize Russia if they could make sure that it was like, well, Russia did this. Then everybody in the world, in their minds, would hate Russia if they could prove that Russia was the one that did it.
Right. And, this is the thing, too. It's like no one would have access to that area afterwards to
Right.
verify the story. Right. What independent journalists are going to go to that area? It's not like you had one journalist during World War II that was able to go to Nagasaki and actually confirm and witness it, an Australian journalist. That was it. They were kept out. You're not allowed to see it. So really, really troubling. I guess if we prepare for it, and, I don't want to say we're preppers here on the show, but we have a garden and we try to live.
We have some chickens.
We have some chickens, and we try to live as closely as we can to the earth and try to actually protect ourselves in these situations, canning food and protecting ourselves. And Dr. John Campbell, again, who's not an alarmist, he's like, you should absolutely keep food on hand, preserves
And iodine pills.
and protecting your family. Again, I can't believe we're talking about this, but Chernobyl did happen, by the way. Like, these things do happen. 3 Mile Island does happen. And when you have a war zone where these nuclear reactors are sat, it can very much happen, right?
And all you have to do is look at who benefits the most and who doesn't from something like that, right? So in order to figure out, because you're right, no one's going to be able to go and actually investigate and verify who did the attack that caused this horrible, horrific event. But all you have to do is look and say, well, who benefited from this? What would be the motivation? I just don't see any motivation whatsoever for Russia to be threatening anything of this sort. I mean, they are not, despite what the Western media says, they're not losing this war. We've been hearing reports since early on that, the Russians are just about to run out of resources and they're going to have to turn around and pack it up and go back home. And this is a giant failure. And I mean, we've been hearing this from the beginning, and that hasn't been the case. They've slowly and methodically gained land. So why would they be the ones to do something disastrous? It would be those who are more desperate to try to, so it wouldn't be difficult for many of us to point the finger in the right direction, I think. But then, of course, if we can't verify it, then, here's the smears. We're all Putin puppets and
right. We're all
Sure.
Russian
Agents.
propagandists. And
Right,
I love
right.
those comments occasionally, like, how much is the Kremlin paying you for this show? And I was like, are you kidding? It's unbelievable. It's laughable. It's
I'm
ridiculous.
waiting for my Kremlin checks. I mean, hey,
Yeah.
then I'm going to get rich, right?
Right.
If I got
It'd
some
be
Kremlin
We'll
checks.
pay it
on
in
the way.
rubles.
It paid in rubles, which is worth more.